My name is Caleb Harms.
And today we are going to be discussing 2 Kings chapters 12 and 13.
So chapter 12, we see Joash does what is pleasing in the eyes of the Lord. So even though it says that he did what is pleasing, it still says that he did not remove all the idol worship that was happening. It was not removed. So even though he was doing what was pleasing, that was something that he did not have removed from his culture. Joash is under the tutelage of Jehoiada, and they go to the temple of the Lord and notice that it is in disrepair, so they decide that they're going to have the priests take some of the contributions that are coming into the temple, and they are to distribute them however they see fit to repair the temple. Moving on to the 23rd year of Joash's reign, he goes in to check and see how the progress is being made on the temple. And they notice that the priests are not using their funds wisely. In fact, they're using it for selfish reasons. They're using it on themselves. So he puts an end to that and says, all right, no more funds to the priests. Instead, they give them to a supervisor who is in charge of distributing that money to skilled workers and for materials and other costs that come along with the building project. And that works out really well. The supervisors seem to be above reproach, and they don't really need to be checked in on. They are doing what they were told to do. Next, we see King Hazael, who is the king of Aram, captures the city of Gath. And kind of after he accomplishes that, he turns his sights towards Jerusalem. Joash sees this coming and goes into the temple of the Lord and grabs a lot of the articles that have been dedicated to the temple of the Lord. A lot of these articles were actually brought to the temple by his father and his grandfather, people that did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And he takes these things and he gives them to the king, and in hopes to kind of buy him off so that way he doesn't attack Jerusalem, and it actually works. So they avoid that conflict completely. Next, we move on through the chapter and we see Joash is actually murdered by his close officials, and his son Amaziah replaces him as king.
And then in chapter 13, we are going to actually shift our attention towards Israel at this time. So Jehoahaz, the son of Jehu, becomes the king of Israel. And of course, in this common theme, we see that he is described as someone who did evil in the eyes of the Lord, same as his father and his grandfather. So people continue in the sins that his grandfather, Jeroboam, had set out in front of these people. And of course, this makes God very angry. So he allows Aram to continue to defeat them and oppress them. Now, Jehoahaz comes to a point of desperation where he finally decides that he is going to pray to the Lord and ask him for help. And with graciousness, the Lord decides that he is going to rescue Israel. Then we see Jehoahaz dies, and we see his son, Jehoash, becomes the king of Israel. He too did evil in the eyes of the Lord. We see an interesting interaction happen between Jehoash and Elisha, as Elisha is basically on his deathbed. He comes to Elisha and is seeking counsel, and Elisha instructs him to shoot one arrow out of this window toward the east, illustrating a victory over Aram, and he calls this the Lord's arrow of victory. Then he tells him to take the remaining arrows and whack them on the ground. Jehoash does this 3 times, and so Elisha then prophesies that Jehoash will have victory over Aram 3 times. Now, then we see this really interesting side story that is mentioned, where some Israelites are burying a body, and some Moabite raiders come through the land and alarm them, and in their distress, they decide to ditch this body and run. And when they do so, they throw the body into Elisha's tomb. And when it touches his bones, it actually comes alive. After this interesting story, we get back to the main storyline where King Hazael has been oppressing Israel. And it tells us that God is gracious and decides to deliver them. In fact, it tells us specifically in verse 23, and to this day, he still has not completely destroyed them or banished them from his presence. Chapter 13 closes with King Hazael dies, and his son, Ben-Hadad, then goes to war with Israel, and where we see Israel defeats them 3 times, just as Elisha had predicted. Now, some summaries that we see here from both of these chapters is that there's an obvious, there's this evidence that humanity's sinful nature is continuing to come up, and they continue to need to be rescued. We also see a very obvious theme of God's faithfulness to fulfill his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So we see that Joash was preserved, was protected as a baby to preserve the messianic line. A very similar story to what we see with Moses as a baby being protected. Also foreshadowing Jesus as a baby being protected. So we see God's faithfulness to fulfill his covenant. We also see God's faithfulness to protect a people that continue to sinfully go against him.